I am extremely honored to be able to present Dr. Peter Fisher. And Dr. Fisher is a Director of Research and Consultant Physician at the Royal London Hospital for Integrative Medicine in London, England, an institution we don't have here equivalent. He's an accredited board certified in both homeopathy and rheumatology there. And the Royal London Hospital for Integrative Medicine is a University College London hospital. It's one of the largest academic medical centers in the UK. And it's the largest public sector for integrative medicine. And also, he is a physician to Her Majesty the Queen. And perhaps we can ask you if he got an invite last Saturday to the big wedding.
Only to a spin-off event, I'm sorry to say.
Okay, so, well, spin-off better than us. Along with doing all of this, he's a member of the World Health Organization expert panel on traditional and complementary medicine, and helped to draft its first strategy statement in 2014 that it goes to 2023. And he speaks to people all over the world and is editor of the International Medical Journal of Homeopathy, where you can see some very interesting work in homeopathy that's going on right now this day. He obviously is still an active clinician, which is wonderful for us, specializing in integrative homeopathy and other forms of complementary medicine. And he likes to have a philosophy which is similar to our own, which is to provide patients with the best of both worlds. And he's led numerous research projects in integrative medicine, including homeopathy. His interest was triggered by a visit to China during the Cultural Revolution, which must have been absolutely fascinating, while he was still a medical student at Cambridge University. And his research work centers on responding to the problems of healthcare, including effectiveness gaps, multimorbidity, antimicrobial resistance, polypharmacy, by integrating the best of conventional and complementary medicine. So before I go on to Iris, we give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then moving on to Iris Bell, who we will hear second. Iris Bell is both a medical doctor and a PhD, and she is a university professor and has been a researcher whom I've met several times in areas related to complementary alternative medicine for 30 years. She served on the faculty of Harvard Medical School, the University of California, San Francisco, and the University of Arizona. She graduated magna cum laude in biology from Harvard University, and then received her PhD in neuro and biobehavioral sciences, and MD from Stanford University. Her psychiatric internship and residency were at the University of California, San Francisco, and she is board certified in psychiatry with added qualifications in geriatric psychiatry, something we very much need. She's licensed to practice conventional medicine in Arizona and California. She's also nationally certified in biofeedback, a fellow of the American College of Nutrition, and a licensed physician in homeopathy and alternative medicine in Arizona. So if we can give a warm welcome to Dr. Iris Bell as our second speaker.
Thank you.
All right. So with both of that, please take it away. We're very excited to hear about research in homeopathy.
Okay, thank you very much, Susie. It's a pleasure to be with you, even if it's at a distance.
Yes.
So this is our hospital on a nice sunny day. This is the Royal London Hospital for Integrated Medicine in Queen Square. And Queen Square for British doctors is synonymous with neurology. Just here, this wall you can just see here is the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery, our leading national center for neurology, but claims to have more Tesla of MRI than the Mass General. I'm not sure if that's true, but they like to claim that. And right behind us is this street here, is Great Ormond Street, which again, for British doctors, indeed the British public, is synonymous with pediatrics. The Great Ormond, they call it GOSH, Great Ormond Street Hospital for Sick Children, is our leading national center for pediatrics. And I have various other roles. This is an interesting one. The World Health Organization, and recently they've added integrative. It used to be traditional medicine, then they made it traditional and complementary medicine, and quite recently they've made it traditional, complementary, and integrative. So that's, their strategy. It's easy to find online. They have a strategy for traditional medicine from 2014 to 2023. Worth a read. It's quite easy to, if you go to WHO website, you'll easily find it. So, first of all, what are we going to talk about? So, what is homeopathy? Homeopathy is actually much misunderstood, and we'll talk about that. Then we'll talk a bit about the demographics, who uses homeopathy and why, including some work from the Harvard School of Public Health. Comparative effectiveness, cost effectiveness research, health technology assessment, then systematic reviews and meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials, and then briefly about some of the biological models and the physical chemistry. And these bottom ones are very important, as we'll see in a moment, because in terms of the plausibility. But we'll come to that in a moment. But that's just to give you a run through of the topics we're going to try and cover. So first of all, what is homeopathy? Well, it's based on this, simple idea in Latin, similia similibus curenta, the treatment of like with like. That is the main principle of homeopathy, and it's in the name. Homoios, pathos, two Greek words, homoios as in homosexual, as in homogeneous, pathos as in pathology. Homoios means the same or similar, pathos means disease or suffering, so same disease, same suffering. It's in the name. And we'll look at exactly what that means in a moment. So that is the main principle of homeopathy. The controversial part of homeopathy, and the reason it attracts a lot of skepticism, is this thing about minimum dose, including ultramolecular dilutions, where, at least in theory, no molecule of the starting substance is present. Although do not confuse that with nothing is present. I said no molecule of the starting substance is present. A lot of other things are present, and I know that Iris is going to talk about that later. And then other things that are really built into homeopathy are holism, the idea of constitution, constitution can be simply explained as treating the person, not the disease. And this word is not terrain, this word is terrain. It's a French word, meaning quite literally soil. It's the idea that certain seeds, where the disease is the seed, the soil is the person, certain diseases, certain seeds flourish in certain soils, certain diseases flourish in people with a certain terrain. It's soil, it just means soil. It's the idea of seed and soil. And then a very important concept in homeopathy, which takes a bit of getting your head around, is this idea of sensitivity, of pre-sensitization. We'll look at some of the biological models, and they just don't work in a stable system. If the system is healthy, nothing happens. You have to make the system sick, sensitize it in some way for it to work. Very important. Takes a little getting your head around, but we'll try to explain that as we go on. So, wait a minute. Okay, so this is our founder, Samuel Hahnemann, German physician, who died in 1843. Interesting lifestyle. Spent most of his life running around Germany, being chased from town to town by the apothecaries who didn't like him, until when he was 75, a young Frenchman came to consult him. This young Frenchman very quickly turned out to be a young French woman who was 33, he was 75. She was very well connected, whisked him off to Paris, and the last 12 years of his life, he became a successful and prosperous society physician. And the tone of his writings changed a lot, I can tell you. But this is his original thing, published in 1796, Essay on a New Curative Principle, in which he described his self-pathogenesis. In other words, he took China, which is the source of quinine, which was at that time a wonder drug in Europe because malaria was highly prevalent, and quinine is an effective treatment. Interesting, the same year as vaccination was introduced by Jenner, 1796. And just one quick thing about vaccination. Homeopathy sometimes gets mixed up with anti-vaxxers, people who think vaccination is a terrible thing, or that you can substitute homeopathy for it. You can't. And it's salutary just to read what Hammond said about it. Look at this. 50 years ago, a city would lose 1/2 and often 3/4 of its children to death by this miserable pestilence, meaning smallpox. Imagine that. And that's what vaccination has done for us. We should never forget that. And I will have no truck with anti-vaxxers. That is not homeopathy. So just to look at, some of the basic idea. Hormesis. Hormesis is simply the beneficial or stimulatory effect of a low dose of a toxin. So by definition, a toxin is bad for you. It has negative effects. But very commonly, in low doses, it has stimulatory effects. So this one, for instance, is the effect of low doses of the insecticide chlordane on the rate of weight gain of crickets. Crickets are insects, chlordane is an insecticide, so it's supposed to kill them. And indeed it does at doses above 100 parts per million. But look what happens at 1 part per million. It doubles their rate of weight gain. And this is by no means an isolated phenomenon. If you're interested, the name to look for is Calabrese. Ed Calabrese is a professor at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and is the Pope of hormesis. And he has, for instance, done large-scale studies on the FDA's databases of cytotoxic drugs, and he finds that this phenomenon is extremely widespread, perhaps universal, paradoxical at low doses. This is the so-called secondary effect. The effect, you give the body a shove, the body then reacts. So it's a secondary effect, the reaction, the body's reaction, not the effect of the drug or the toxin, the body's reaction to it. And this is an extremely widespread phenomenon. Some people will tell you it's universal. There it is, just to show you that one. But I could show, there are literally thousands and thousands of examples of this. And it's the conventional model is the linear threshold or non-threshold, which would say that, for the threshold model, it comes to the baseline there and then goes flat. Or non-threshold, it just goes straight down to the baseline. Not that it reverses at low doses, but as I say, this is a very, very widespread phenomenon. And it is similar to what we're achieving, the secondary effect, the body's reaction to a toxin or to a drug. And you can also get it with physical media. That's the effect of low dose gamma radiation on the rate of weight gain of guinea pigs. But as I say, there are thousands and thousands of examples of this. And I could point to many other, paradoxical or rebound effects. Rebound effects of treatment are extremely rare, extremely common. If you treat somebody with a beta blocker and then stop their beta blocker, the blood pressure will rebound. It will be higher than it was at the beginning. And we know why that is, actually. We know exactly how that happens. So these effects are extremely widespread. And in homeopathy, we're exploiting them in a therapeutic sense. But this is the controversial part. This is how you make a homeopathic 6C dilution, which is one of the commonly used dilutions. So you take your mother tincture, your strong alcoholic concentrate, and this is defined. The US Homeopathic Pharmacopoeia, for instance, defines exactly what it has to be, how you can test for it, and it's FDA recognized. You then dilute it with 99 parts of a water ethanol mixture and succuss it, which just means you shake it, banging it against an elastic stop. And you do that 6 times over for 6C. Since 100 is 10 squared, that's a 10 to the minus 12 dilution. And then usually, it can be given in liquid form, but usually on lactose or sucrose pills. So that's a 6C, one of the commonly used dilutions. But there is this Avogadro's law, or Loschmidt's constant. Actually, there's one of the numerous causes of European disunity is whether we call it Avogadro or Loschmidt. Most people call it Avogadro's law, but in the German-speaking world, it's known as Loschmidt's constant. Actually, Avogadro invented the principle, discovered the principle. Loschmidt worked out the number. And the thing perhaps to remember is that the number is of the order of 10 to the 23. The number of particles, that means atoms or molecules in 1 gram mole, is of the order of 10 to the 23. So the implication of that is that there is unlikely to be much starting substance present in dilutions above here. So if you were to do this twice over a 12C, it is very unlikely there would be particles of the starting substance present, although there are exceptions. And it's the fact that there is no starting substance present doesn't mean there is nothing present. You need to be very careful about that. Iris is going to talk to you a bit more about the structures that are present. So First of all, the demographics. Who uses homeopathy, and how do the results of family physicians who use homeopathy compare with those who do not? So the use of homeopathy goes up to 10% of the population. In France, is the highest we have. Probably in India, the usage is higher, but we don't have good figures, and higher still for children in France. So overall, 4% of the population is purchasing in 12 months, 1.5% consulting practitioners. But some of these countries, South Korea, Japan, Singapore, do not have high levels of use. So that's a very broad brush picture. But we do have a fair amount of data of how much it's used. And to look at the use in the States, this is good quality data. This is from the National Health into the Federal National Health Interview, analyzed by the Harvard Division of General Medicine and Primary Care, Michelle Dossett. So just over 2% of the population in 2012 used homeopathy, 15% increase, more likely to be women, healthier lifestyle, and high levels of education. They're more likely to use multiple complementary therapies, but perceive it as very helpful, more helpful than supplements, for instance. Let me just show you that. Oh, this is my favorite. Let me just show you this. This is the education. Okay, so if users of homeopathy tend to have a high level of education, which I just like that, and that has very, very similar patterns have been found in France and Germany, that it correlates with female gender, healthy lifestyle, and a high level of education, the use of homeopathy. And this is the perceived helpfulness. So here we have homeopathy given by a practitioner. And, users perceive it as more helpful than homeopathy given alone, more helpful than supplements, at least as helpful as chiropractic and osteopathy, and more so than acupuncture. So it is perceived as one of the most effective modalities of complementary medicine. So this is general health and well-being. This is specific conditions. So homeopathy, particularly when used by a practitioner, is perceived as very helpful by US users. Large-scale study of homeopathy done in France, over 6,000 patients, comparing conventional, mixed, and homeopathic physicians in these cohorts. This is the bread and butter of family practice, musculoskeletal pain, upper respiratory tract infections, sleep disorders, anxiety and depression, extremely common conditions, very frequently treated in general practice, family care, family practice. So they are over 6,000 patients, and the use is relatively low for cardiovascular disorders, but higher than control than the baseline for anxiety and depression, osteoarthritis and joint disease, and upper respiratory tract infections. In France, this is. Again, more female, higher education, no big difference in comorbidities or quality of life, large difference in healthier lifestyle, belief in holistic and natural treatments, not surprisingly, attitude to participating in their own care. And here there is some debate, about which direction this passes in. Is it the patients go to a homeopath because they have they believe in taking charge of their health, or do the homeopathic physicians encourage them to do so? We don't know the answer to that. The authors of this admit they don't know the answer. It's an interesting question. And sorry, you'll have to excuse me again. Education, high levels of education, and less likely to be overweight, less likely to smoke. So higher levels of education, healthier lifestyles are associated with the use of homeopathy. And there are also, this is musculoskeletal disease. The patients were not different, except that the homeopathic patients were more chronic. The problem, of course, with comparative effectiveness studies is that it's not randomized. You're taking patients who choose to go to a homeopath, not randomized to go to see a homeopathic physician. The advantage, of course, is that it's realistic. It tells you what happens in the real life. similar progression, but the really dramatic difference was non-steroidal use, well, use of analgesics in general. So that's to show you. So this is in the acute situation. The homeopathic physicians are using just over half, 60% of the non-steroidals of conventional physicians. And in the chronic situation, even more marked, half. They're using half the number of non-steroidals. And non-steroidals are dangerous drugs. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that. They cause gastric problems and also a lot of renal problems. They are dangerous drugs. And the homeopathic physicians are using a lot less of them. Another cohort, this is the upper respiratory tract infections. Again, this big difference, an even bigger difference in the number of antibiotics they're using, and similar differences with antipyretics, anti-inflammatories. So 43%, they're using less than half the number of antibiotics. And I'm sure I don't have to tell you that antimicrobial resistance is a huge global problem, and anything we can do to reduce the use of antimicrobials is a good thing. For very similar evolutions, there were a few patients who probably needed antibiotics. Small, non-significant, but there were probably a few. So what's the problem? That's what integrative medicine's about. Use antibiotics when you need them, but not when you don't. Where's the problem? I have no problem with that at all. And then the cost effectiveness are really big. I mean, so they have data on the consultation, the prescription, and the total cost. So the consultations were longer and more expensive, but the prescriptions are much cheaper. And the bottom line is 20% less. A really big difference for, you know, common problems. As I said, the things very commonly treated in family practice. And I don't know of anything that has a potential to deliver that sort of cost saving. 20% is a huge difference. So this is the overall conclusions. Far fewer. I've showed you the non-steroidal antibiotics. I didn't show you the antidepressants and the sleeping pills, but the pattern is very similar again. Less than half, and actually slightly better results than with conventional medicine. So, you know, these people came to the conclusion it's an important interest to public health. And this was, you know, distinguished people, including what had been the, I think we would call it the Surgeon General of France, the sort of chief, you know, big cheese of French medicine guy, who was a really big cheese in France. He was one of the authors. Rather similar thing done in Germany. Again, typical thing, very typical, you know, things you treated in primary care and family practice, and quite long-term outcomes in terms of severity of symptoms and quality of life and costs. So basically, let me show you this. This is the SF36, widely used quality of life tool. So this is over 12 months, and this is for adults. This is the physical component. This is the mental component. This, in the first 6 months, it's highly significant, really big difference. And in fact, so much of a difference that actually you have what we call a ceiling effect here. They were practically better. There wasn't much potential to get any better. So big difference and statistically very significant. Mental component, not statistically significant, but nevertheless, the homeopathic group started off worse and ended up better. And again, you will notice my favorite thing, adjusted for educational level, but they had to adjust it because the homeopathic patients were better educated. So a very meticulous bit of work done by the Charité Medical Center in Berlin, the biggest academic medical center in Germany. And the costs were the same. So the French got better costs for the same results. The Germans got better results for the same cost. You know, it swings and roundabouts, but either way, you know, it is favorable to integrating homeopathy. And I emphasize it is integrating homeopathy. You're not just using homeopathy. And as we saw with the French doctors, they were using plenty of conventional drugs, but, you know, 40 to 60% of the conventional drugs of their colleagues who didn't use homeopathy. So This is an interesting study, again, about averting antibiotics for acute otitis media, done in a good center. This is the University Pediatric Clinic in Bern, the capital of Switzerland. They just took 230 consecutive consultations. They gave them a homeopathic treatment. If they weren't better in 6 hours, they gave them a second homeopathic medicine. If they weren't pain-free in 12 hours, they gave them an antibiotic, which is, I think, a bit early, actually, to jump to antibiotics, but this was a few years ago. But anyway, 72% were pain-free within 12 hours. The remainder got antibiotics. And it was uncontrolled, but actually there are series published, and the resolution was about 2.5 times as fast as you would have expected from the literature. Another Swiss study, this is a health technology assessment, an interesting method. It looks at the thing all round. So it looks at the outcome of clinical trials, the costs, the availability, the appropriateness, and so on, and makes a recommendation. Is this something that our country, our health system should be using or not? So here they're looking at upper respiratory tract infections and allergies. It's the whole book, actually. They published a whole book on it. This is the chapter on upper respiratory tract infections and allergies. And so 6 out of 7 trials, which compared homeopathy with standard treatment, showed equivalence. The one that didn't was a very brave, and I'm not sure if it was ethical, study, penicillin versus homeopathy for streptococcal tonsillitis. Penicillin, of course, is highly effective for streptococcal infections, and you shouldn't, the Helsinki guidelines say you should not risk, if there is a good known effective treatment, you must give it. You shouldn't be giving placebo. So this is a little dubious, I think. And the half of the placebo-controlled studies showed statistically significant results in favor of homeopathy. 4 showed a trend, 4 showed no advantage. So what they concluded was 24 out of 29 trials are on the whole positive, and they say probable effectiveness, which sounds a bit, dubious, but they only had three things to three descriptors, so probable, possible, or unlikely. So probable was actually the most positive one they could have had. And subsequently, the Swiss government has adopted homeopathy as part of several, but they now have several, but including homeopathy, several integrative therapies on their compulsory insurance. They had and indeed they had a referendum on it, the Swiss love referendums, and got a big majority, 2/3, 67%, or 66% was it? Anyway, it was a big majority in favor of including complementary medicines, including homeopathy, osteopathy, acupuncture, and a couple of others on the the compulsory insurance in Switzerland. All right, so the so-called, class 1 evidence, randomized controlled trials, and systematic reviews and meta-analysis of such trials. So no evidence? Well, I checked it this morning. This website, which you can access for free. You have to register, but you don't have to pay for it. Check for yourself. This morning it was saying 1,210 clinical trials of homeopathy. That was hot off the press. Of which actually I didn't check this number, it's probably gone up a bit. So in the region of 500 randomized controlled trials, mostly against placebo, some against standard treatment. Interesting one, for instance, of homeopathy versus Prozac for depression, at least as effective. So that's against standard treatment. What you'll very often find is it's as effective but causes less adverse effects. And when you look at the breakdown, 41% are positive, a lot are inconclusive, nearly always because they're underpowered. They don't have enough patients, 5% are negative. And actually this is remarkably similar to systematic reviews of conventional medicine. Those are the numbers for conventional medicine. Remarkably similar. And a recent study, meta-analysis of the best quality randomized controlled trials. They found 22 trials that were analyzable. And of the 3 most reliable, of which I believe 2 or maybe even 3 were done by IRIS. Congratulations, IRIS. I believe you will find that nearly all of these ones, the best studies, were done by IRIS. So this is improving quality. odds ratio of 1, meaning that homeopathy was equivalent to placebo. All of them lie on the right. The mean, this is the mean. This is the 95% confidence intervals. All 33, anyway, you look at it, come out positive. And rather unusually, the mean moved to the right. Usually with improving quality, you would expect it to move closer to no effect. But actually, these move in the opposite direction. The bars get wider because you've got smaller numbers. But actually, the mean is moving to the right. So all, or any high quality trials of homeopathy have positive results. Just to look at the...
Peter, if I can interrupt you for 1 second.
Yeah, am I running out of time?
We're getting close to the end of your time. Just wanted to give you that warning.
All right. Well, let me jump quickly to the biological. Sorry, we've got a lot. Okay, biological models. Okay, so again, no evidence. This morning there were 2,402 biological experiments on this website, which again you can access for free. And here's a systematic review of biological experiments done in the last 21 years. 126 replicated. The null hypothesis, in other words, the repetition would not show a difference between test and control, that the original study was positive, the follow-up was negative. 70% have said that isn't true. 20% were irreproducible, 9% had opposite results. Don't ask me why that should be. But 70%, and this was over 21 years, this book had been published in 1994, so they did a 21st anniversary coming of age review of it. And this is perhaps the most reliable single study. So this is the basophil degranulation test. It's an in vitro model of allergy. So this is a basophil. It's a circulating mast cell. If it's stimulated either by the anti-IgE, sorry, by an antigen, if you've got hay fever and you mix it with pollen, it will degranulate. Or with anti-IgE, which will make it any basophil degranulate. And that releases histamine into the supernatant. You then get a feedback inhibition effect. It tends to turn off the effect. But you get the same thing with the ghost of histamine, with histamine 16C, which is well into the ultramolecular range. And this has been reproduced multiple times. So I'm just going to skip through this quickly. Yeah, this is to show, positive repetition. Again, this pattern, nearly all of them are positive. Some of them are multi-center, independent, and so anyway you look at it, most of them, nearly all of them, are positive. I think this is a nice one, but I think we're going to skip through it. So let me just look at some recent high-tech thing. This is polymerase chain reaction of activation of arnica. Arnica, which is used for injuries, trauma, basically. So this was done by an Italian team led by a guy called Paolo Bellaviti. They looked at arnica in various dilutions, including into the ultramolecular range. And what they showed, so changes in gene expression. So this is, what the genes that are getting turned on. These are the genes that are getting turned off. Very similar in the two, as you can see. And what it means is that basically it's changing the phenotype, the phenotype of the neutrophils to the wound healing type. It modifies remodeling, inflammation, and chemotaxis. Let's skip through. Let's very quickly look at the physical chemistry. Sorry, I didn't measure my time properly. This is a rather... No, let's skip this one, sorry. It's a rather charming one, but we've got to jump through it. Okay, so this is an interesting method. This is low temperature thermoluminescence of dilutions of, very high dilutions of sodium chloride and lithium chloride. And it's done in dideuterium oxide heavy water. Apparently you get a cleaner signal. And they cool it to very, very low temperatures. This is minus 200 Kelvin roughly. It's actually the temperature of liquid nitrogen. You bombard it with hard radiation, hard X-rays or gamma rays. That excites the electrons of the water molecules. They jump from there into a higher quantum state. As you warm it up, they fall back into their ground state, and that generates a thermoluminescent glow. So just to show you, so this is the total glow you get when you warm this stuff up from 77 Kelvin to about 270 Kelvin, or otherwise known as 0 Celsius. So the total number of total number of photons emitted, big differences, much lower with lithium chloride, lower with sodium chloride, and this is just plain shaken heavy water. And that's to show, and so this is lithium chloride, this is sodium chloride, this is plain shaken water. And I'm told that an expert would instantly recognize this as the signature of lithium chloride. So here you are at 70 Kelvin, here you are at 210 Kelvin. As you warm it up, you get this glow happening. Big difference, as you can see. There are a number of other methods, of physical methods, that show similar things. So just to summarize, who uses clinical effectiveness? Economics. Patients who use homeopathy tend to be highly educated, have a healthy lifestyle. Clinical effectiveness in the acute situation, so we didn't really look at that in great detail, but better results in routine practice. In the chronic situation, above all, fewer harmful drugs. And polypharmacy is a huge problem. And health technology assessments and economic analyses have been positive. Randomized controlled trials, over 1,100 trials. It's actually no, over 1,200. I must update that one. Nearly 500 randomized controlled trials, and so on. We looked quickly at this. Animal models, we didn't. Well, we looked quickly at arnica. Important to note that we didn't have time to enlarge on it, but all of them require pre-sensitization. Nothing happens if you don't have a pre-sensitized system. Physics and chemistry, we didn't have time to look at that one, but we looked at this one. Low temperature, the signature persists at ultramolecular dilution, and there are other methods. So, and if you really want to know what's going on, that's a journal which I'm editor-in-chief of. And thank you for listening. Sorry if I overrun my time. Thank you so much.
We're going to move to Iris next, and then Q&A at the very end.
What I'm going to pick up on is this whole notion of the skeptical question about, if you're diluting these remedies or medicines, what do you end up with? Do you end up with anything at all? And so I'm going to quickly point out that the skeptics just keep saying there's nothing there, so this is ridiculous. If you have a positive finding, so what? It's an accident. And my argument is going to be very quickly that there is a great deal of data at this point suggesting that there are some very unique kinds of findings about remedies that build upon the thermoluminescence finding that Peter just went through. And it's a very striking set of data that allow you to put together a potential model for how this all works. And my emphasis is really that you're going to find truly structures in the material that generate signals that have been demonstrated that will then trigger nonlinear responses in the organism as a complex adaptive system that is self-organized and actually has self-similarity at different levels. But let's begin with the simple issue of how do we make these remedies again? And this is simplistic, but basically we either grind an insoluble source material, or we put, for example, an herbal source material into an ethanol solution. And then we proceed with the serial dilution process, which is typically done in an ethanol water solvent. After every dilution step, whether it's 1 to 10, 1 to 100, 1 to 50,000, or something else, we are doing it and then follow that dilution with what we call succussion, which is an intense agitation of the vial. in classic form against the Bible, but it works if you use an ordinary book. Let me see here. Okay. Now, this is the overview that I mentioned a second ago. My model that I want to give you some of the data for are that when you pick the correct remedy for the stressed organism, which is diseased or stressed or however you want to mention it, the signal is salient to that organism. It leads to a self-amplified adaptive response across the networks of the body, which induce the healing process. So the remedy itself is not acting like a drug. It is acting much more like a signal to tell the body that it can heal. And it probably takes advantage of the hormesis that Peter mentioned. So what are our findings? Well, if you prepare things classically in homeopathy, it turns out that from 2010 on, there have been now numerous studies published demonstrating with electron microscopy and other methods that you actually have generated nanoparticles, very, very tiny sized particles of the source material, which continue to be present even at what are considered to be higher potencies. So even as you get to higher potencies, you may find that a lot of the nanoparticles you see are what are called quantum dot size. They're actually less than 5 or 10 nanometers in diameter. They're so small that many methods can't even detect them, and only certain very specialized electron microscopy can. So it's a very important thing to be aware that when you say there's no remaining source material, what you're really saying is there's no remaining bulk source material, but there is nanoscale material that is present. This is a study that we did a few years ago, looking at a remedy prepared from a source of silver, and we did it with very classical materials that included natural corks as the stoppers. And I want to emphasize our subsequent work suggests the reason the size of the nanoparticles looks similar and fairly large may be because the cork material, the plant, oak tree, which is the source of these stoppers, may actually attach to the outside, adsorb to the outside of the source nanoparticles and create a coating that becomes somewhat more uniform. And you can see that that's very different from either a succussed control or an unsuccussed control. There is some suggestion that if the material is a little bit succussed, even if it's just ethanol solution in water, there may be some particles there. And I'll show you in a moment what I mean by that. Now, the other point is that particles like this develop their own properties on the outside surface. And they can become more stable if they're either at on a zeta potential of a minus 30 millivolts or a plus 30 millivolts. And interestingly, what you see are that most of the materials that are succussed tend to be very close to or better than, that's both the verum and the succussed controls, better than an unsuccussed ethanol control. And that's important because it means that these particles have unique surface properties different from an ordinary, quote, placebo. Well, how did they get there, these nanoparticles, if we're supposedly doing these dilutions? Well, it's actually, in the actual mechanical sense, not a straightforward process. It turns out that when succussions are done, there is direct evidence performed by the original group in India that first published on the finding of nanoparticles that you get layers of particles surrounded by nanobubbles. So you not only get the particles themselves, but you get little bubbles that are at the nanoscale, 10 to the minus 9th of a meter. And those bubbles carry the particles up to layers, And if you put your pipette in certain places, you pick off the nanoparticles and move them into the next dilution. Now you'll say, well, at the higher potencies, you make it just in the same piece of glassware. There is separate evidence in the nanotechnology world that if you agitate a solution, for example, of salt in a glass material, that the nanoparticles form from the agitation itself and will embed themselves on the glassware. So if you're reusing the same piece of glassware to do serial dilutions by removing most of what you have and then adding fresh solvent, what you're doing is giving the glassware the opportunity to participate in formation of the higher potencies. So either way, when you're making it, including succussion, you are probably generating these nanostructures and somewhat irregularly sampling them from one potency to the next. This is a very limited slide. There are many other studies now showing that at these so-called higher potencies where the dilution is way past Avogadro's number, we're still finding nanostructures of the source material confirmed with specific physical chemistry tests. Now, in addition to that, classically, we make remedies in glassware. And it turns out that there are multiple replicated studies now demonstrating that when you bang a piece of glassware around, you actually release silicates from the silica in the glassware. You release other salts as well into solution, but one of the higher concentrations from glass is actually the silica. Now, silica turns out to be a very interesting finding because a subsequent study, again by that original group in India, has demonstrated that it wanders around in solution, finds those charged surfaces of the source material nanoparticles, and surrounds them with a coating of silica, which is a known phenomenon in the nanotechnology world, where you get silica coatings around core material. When you do that, what you have is a material where silica has been demonstrated to be a better vehicle for triggering immune reactions, a better vehicle along with lactose sometimes for getting into, for example, cancer cells and helping the material do its effects on a cancer cell, but not a healthy cell. So there are some very striking features of the actual manufacturing, which turn out to be fascinating and potentially very important biologically. Silica is also used as an adjuvant in some vaccines in order to improve the immune response. So it's a very interesting material all by itself. Well, is it biologically active? Do we have any evidence in homeopathic medicines of this? This is an in vitro study looking at wound closure when the material was exposed either to controls, succussed or unsuccussed, or to a combination homeopathic set of potencies made from various plants that are typically used in healing wounds. What you see on this item here, the tall bar, is a taller bar, is better wound closure with the verum material. What you see, however, with the succussed solvent all by itself, which presumably is silica potentially forming in the solution as a result of the manufacturing process, it too has a somewhat healing effect compared with the control or other things. These are different kinds of controls showing you the maximum healing that could have occurred, for example. So we have a very interesting finding that there is a non-specific factor in many remedies that are made classically, and there is a specific factor when you have the remedy source. This is just a long list of physical chemistry techniques that have been used to study homeopathic materials. And typically, they have found that there are differences between the verum and the placebo in these kinds of very sophisticated tests. Now, I just want to emphasize that when that happens, when you've created these nanostructures, including these tiny quantum dots, which probably move around in solvent very easily because they're so tiny in size and so easy to pick up with your pipetting, or to leave in solution if you're leaving a layer or coat of the solvent. They can serve as biological stress signals and trigger a whole cascade of defensive events in the cell defense system of the body. You can get electromagnetic signals, optical signals, and you can get quantum coherence and quantum entanglement, particularly when you're dealing with a quantum dot-sized material, where literally the electrons, the atoms and their electrons are trapped on the particle in such a way that when the electron cloud moves around, it generates quantum phenomena. So you have some fascinating possibilities of what these particles can generate. Here is one study using somewhat lower potencies showing a detectable electromagnetic signal in material prepared homeopathically from bacteria. There is a different study using a different luminescence technique, delayed luminescence, showing that even with extremely high potency homeopathics, you can detect significant differences from again, this was a silver metal source material at high potency compared with an ordinary lactose globule that had no remedy on it or no medicine on it. So maybe you have these signals. Well, what could respond to these signals? We have direct evidence in our own laboratory that you will definitely get brainwave responses of a salient remedy, showing changes in alpha EEG patterning when the person sniffs a remedy. So we know, as Hahnemann actually wrote years ago, that the olfactory sensory system can detect the specific information of the remedy without direct physical contact, but held close to the nose. There is also the cell stress or cell danger response network. It involves the immune system. It involves cell-to-cell signaling. And I want to emphasize that signaling in the body involves nanoscale materials. That includes things like that are called exosomes, that are little nanovesicles that are released. For example, cancer cells may release exosomes when they're trying to seed a metastasis. But what if you also have more appropriate cell-to-cell signaling going on, where the one cell is warning others, hey, we just got a message here, we better respond to this in some way. Well, what does that mean? Well, the body doesn't just sit there and act mechanically. It is an adaptive physiological system. And so when you send a mild signal to it, it triggers an adaptive response where the body is preparing itself for future injury or repairing itself from existing injury. And what happens is, if you have given a stimulus which is cross-reactive to the original insult, whether it be psychological or physical in nature, you will actually increase or get cross-resistance to the same or a similar stressor. This is well known in the world of physiology. It's no big surprise that it maps interestingly onto Hahnemann's model. If you dig down a little bit deeper, you see that there are things like reactive oxygen species, heat shock proteins, macrophages, cytokines, and the olfactory system, which are all part of the network that is the cell danger or stress response network biologically. All of those kinds of factors have been shown to be modified in both in vitro and some in vivo systems by homeopathic medicines that are appropriate to the circumstance of injury that is in the experimental model.
Excuse me, Iris, I sure hate to interrupt you. This has been really fascinating.
I know.
Unfortunately, we have a bunch of clinicians here who have to leave now to go to their clinic at 1 o'clock, which is why we said we could only go to 12:30 our time.
Right.
I'm wondering if you want to just take like a last minute to tell us like your big punch take-home message, and
Sure.
if there's anything, you know, where we can look for more information,
Sure.
that would be great as well. Thanks.
Sure. Well, I have a long bibliography, but basically there are amplification mechanisms that have been studied with homeopathic medicines and in other contexts. Stochastic resonance, hormesis, time-dependent sensitization. All of these interact with the adaptive system. There is a demonstration of hormesis in an in vitro system using homeopathic metal nanoparticles. And basically the notion that if we've been, with our EEG responses, shown an adaptive response after a 30C potency is given of one of 2 different remedies in young adults. And so our take-home points are, there are nanostructures that generate unique signals, and there's a lot of science behind it at this point. You get adaptive systemic responses by the amplification the body is capable of doing. And then there are mechanisms we can start digging down into, such as modulation of central nervous system function and macrophage function that involve gene expression, immune function, and inflammation modulation. And I think we have a lot of fascinating clues going forward for really understanding how remedies actually affect a living patient. So I will stop there. And just turn it over if there are any questions for anyone who is still there. I'm sure we're both happy to answer them.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for both of you. This has been incredibly fascinating to kind of hear what the last couple of years have been for the research in homeopathy in particular. That's wonderful. And for me, I mean, hearing about kind of the mechanistic research that you're doing, Irish, is very exciting to kind of think about how that might move the field forward, because I think it has definitely held the field back so far. But I'm going to just say, we do have people still here. Do people have questions you want to ask either of our presenters? Yeah, Rick.
Question about clinical reproducibility of some of the larger studies. Do we have any? I know they're usually in the meta-analyses they do. They look at all the different studies, RCTs around on homeopathy, but do we have any that show that consistent reproducible clinical effects in large RCTs?
Okay. Sorry, yes, thank you for the question. The answer is yes. And the area, of course, one of the problems is that individualized homeopathy is, not surprisingly, individualized and therefore difficult to reproduce. But one area where there is certainly reproduced evidence is isopathy. So isopathy is not the treatment of like with like, but the same with the same. So there's a series of studies looking at treating hay fever, allergic asthma, perennial rhinitis with isopathy, with the allergen. So that might be pollen or house dust mite. And there are a series of studies, and the results are remarkably consistent and robust. Beyond that, I think there should be more reproduced studies. I agree. There aren't as many as one might wish. But, you know, I did, many years ago, did a study of a particular homeopathic medicine for fibromyalgia. Iris more recently has done something quite simple. It's quite similar, not identical, but similar and with congruent results.
Great, thank you, Peter. Other questions? I was just going to ask Iris too, like, what are your next planned steps for thinking about how to test the impacts of the nanoparticles?
Well, I think my next planned steps are to find collaborators with laboratories who have the biological systems worked out, particularly involving macrophage, because I think that that's going to be the gateway into the series of effects. And there are other studies looking at plants that I think Peter alluded to a little bit, where we're looking really at the crystalline, the complex system formation, the actual visual formation of complex structures in the recipient when the remedy is capable of affecting it. So those are the directions I'd like to go in. Ultimately, the trouble with studying complex systems is that you need thousands of data points in order to actually evaluate the effect on complexity itself in a person. And I actually believe that physiological systems like EEG and possibly heart rate variability are going to be good targets for that kind of work.
Thanks, that sounds great. Sounds like you're going to need some big data experts with you as well.
Absolutely.
Yes. All right, well, thank you both so much. I'm sorry we had limited time to spend with you. We could obviously have spent a great deal of time, and I know some people had to leave, and if they have any questions, I will definitely send them your way to get some answers. And thank you so much for sharing the resources and websites that we can look up more about this.